My story might be a little different than some people's because I actually grew up in a wonderful, loving Christian home. But I grew up in a small town up in Terrace, and we went to a little church, little Christian Reformed church there. I went to Christian school, church every Sunday, that kind of stuff. And but an elder in that church sexually abused me for quite a few years as a kid, and it was something I kept hidden for a long time. So when I tried alcohol for the first time at the age of 12, it was the first time that I felt any sort of release from all of that stuff that I was carrying. And the second time I tried alcohol, which was right the next day after, I ended up in the hospital with alcohol poisoning. I was 12 years old. So already then, I don't think my body did alcohol well. And then we lived in Terrace till I was 16, and I kind of, played around with it. But I had a pretty, we moved out here from Terrace when I was 16, and I went to high school in Surrey, Christian high school. And, we partied on the weekend, and not much different than anybody else. Although, looking back, I recognize that, I didn't say no, or I didn't quit when most people quit, right? I was always the one that closed down the party, always the one taking the risks of drinking and driving and that kind of stuff. And everything was, hidden behind my parents' back, and everything looked really great on the outside, and I learned to do that very well. And so I got married 2 months out of high school because I got pregnant by this guy that I'd known for about 4 months. I stayed in that marriage and had 3 amazing children, and just, I drank, but nothing, my belief was always, if my kids weren't home or something, it was never a conscious thing. I didn't realize I had an issue with alcohol or anything like that. It was just, you had people over and you drink wine, or, we're from a Dutch family, so that's what you do. But there was always that, looking back, always that feeling of I need more, right? Like I go to the in-laws and we'd have a couple glasses of wine, and then on the way home I'd stop and buy another bottle, right? But no concept, right? I mean, I came from a little Christian home. We didn't learn about addiction or anything, right? When my first marriage fell apart, my whole world fell apart in a 24-hour period. And I became a single mom with 3 kids. And within days, I met a guy that introduced me to pot, and I had smoked a joint or 2 in high school, but it was never a thing for me, right? But I was very, very angry at God at that time because my marriage had fallen apart. And I was I homeschooled my kids. My kids went to Christian school. I was one of these people that I was going to stay married forever. Like, there was no concept in my world that my husband would ever, it just wasn't something I ever thought, right? So I started using pot to just kind of deal with life. And my kids didn't know, and I really believed, and I know this sounds funny coming from somebody that's, born and raised in the Bible, but I really believed that God created marijuana for me so that I didn't have to go on substances like Prozac and stuff, because they did that. When my marriage fell apart, I kind of went off the deep end a bit, and they tried all these antidepressants with me and stuff, and it just didn't fit for me. So when I tried pot, I really believed, like, this is my solution. And I started off very casually, right, on the weekends when the kids were, like, visiting, family or something like that. But you're a single mom, and you put the kids to bed, and then, I'd smoke a joint. And so marijuana actually became one of my first real major addictions. And then, that wasn't enough. So then it was marijuana and alcohol, right? And you kind of, like, it's a progressive disease, right? So it gets worse as time goes on. And trying to be a single mom, and I had no, I'd right out of high school when I got married, so I had no skills behind me other than being a mom. I was living in a trailer court in Langley because I was on the welfare system and putting my kids in Christian school and trying to figure out what to do with my life. And I went into school to be a community support worker. I went to Quantman, and I started going to school full time, but we were living in this trailer court and then smoking some pot with these people in the trailer court. And we had a girl that lived beside us who had a really messed up life, and I didn't know much about people from messed up lives, because, it wasn't my world. And, we started helping her out, and her boyfriend did crystal meth. And I didn't know nothing about it, but, you know, having a bad day one day, the kids were in school, and he said, here, try this. And I was already, you know, I'd been smoking some pot and had a little bit of alcohol in my system. And so I had 3 what we call hoots from a straw off a broken light bulb of this drug. And, you know, your inhibitions are down and you're not thinking it's going to cause any harm. And I was instantly addicted to it. And what happened for me was it gave, even off of 3 tokes at that time, it gave me the ability to clean my house and stay awake. And I just felt like it was almost like a super drug where I could just be this super mom and, you know, because I was angry at God and angry at the world and, you know, so I was kind of dabbling in it when I started dating my now husband. Now, my now husband was my best friend in high school. And he was in love with me in high school, but I didn't know that. So he was actually the usher at my first wedding. So I was kind of dabbling in it, but he had no idea. Like his world, he'd never been married before. He's a truck driver. He worked. He's as solid as the day is long. I call him my vanilla man. He had no idea. So he went into a relationship with me knowing I smoked pot, but we didn't recognize it as an addiction at that time. And I hid it from him. But before we got married, when we were dating and stuff, it was very casual for me. Just once in a while, just once in a while. And we got married, and he took on, you know, my 3 kids. Their dad wasn't too present in their life. And I slowly started to do it more and more. And he was at work all day, and I was had become a community support worker. So I had a job. I was working with challenged people, and, you know, my excuse always was I'm working a little late. And, you know, and slowly that drug started to infiltrate our life. And I was in charge of the finances, so you need money, especially if you're drinking and you're smoking marijuana and you're smoking crystal meth. So I started taking from our finances. Over time, probably within a 6-month period, our life went to a place where couldn't pay the rent. We were getting just kicked out of places. And my husband started to recognize that there was something really weird. He didn't know at first because I took care of all the finances and everything, so I really hid it well. I started doing a little bit of crime. I was not good at it. I got busted almost every time. I have a criminal record now because you get caught up in that world of people that are in that world, and they taught me a very different lifestyle than what I knew. And so I put gravel in my husband's pop at nighttime. He'd always have his Diet Coke, and I put 2 gravel in there so that he would sleep really soundly. And as soon as he was asleep, I'd get in the car. We lived in Aldergrove, and I'd drive down to Surrey, where what I call my dope land was. Down in Bridgeview, had all these dope houses. Back then, they didn't live in tents. They all lived in abandoned houses. And I'd hang out there for a couple hours, get high, drive home, and be back in bed before my husband would leave for work. And I really lived that double life for not a really long period of time because crystal meth takes you out very fast. And at one point, my children were 16. I have a daughter who was 16. My middle daughter was 13, and my son was 11. And I was still running a household, and things started to slowly slip. And we ended up not having a telephone for a long period of time because I couldn't pay the phone bill. Then we lost our hydro bill. My kids were washing their hair with a garden hose in the backyard before they left to go to school. We didn't have much food in the house. They were cooking on a Coleman stove. We didn't have heat. I used to try and make this, you know, you're so high. Like, life is just so stupid in your own brain when you're high all the time. And I put candles out everywhere and try and pretend like we're having a picnic. And you know, it was quite a short time that we went through that. And my sister found out that I was doing crystal meth. My husband knew at this time, but didn't know how intense it was, and he didn't know what to do with it. Like, he just did not, we didn't know there were resources. We didn't know anything, right? We're just kind of going through it. And And so my sister asked to take my kids for a couple days over spring break, and they went to her house often. And so in my sick, twisted mind at that time, I thought, it gives me, I don't have responsibility for a few days, you know, I can get high, my husband's going to be at work. Like, you know, the difference in who I was raising those kids, sorry, to who I became was against every moral and value I ever had. And my kids didn't come home. And my family found out, and my husband finally found out how bad the addiction was. I had hooked up with a guy who did crystal meth, and we spent a lot of time. He's the one that got me involved in crime and stuff like that. He'd been in addiction for years, and his name was Corey. And so when my kids left, I became that mom that I never thought I would be, never even imagined I'd be. And 2 days after my kids left, social services came to my door and went through my house to see, you know, what kind of parent I was. And I had that moment of clarity where I recognized that I had become that person that I so despised. And that very same day, the guy that I hung out with introduced me to a needle. And I started intravenously using crystal meth. And I didn't care if I lived or died. I didn't have my kids. My marriage was a mess. And for the next 8 months, I spent time mainly with this guy and shot up. And he shot me up. I never shot myself up. So we were together all the time. You go into a very different world when you start using needles. You don't hang out with people in the same way. And I don't know. I mean, I know it was God, but, you know, after about 7, 8 months of that, my husband just went to work every day, and he just hung on, and I fought with him and pushed him away and tried to get him to leave me, and he just felt like if he left me, I would get lost. And he knew that, and I believe that was God. And one day I just got tired of being somebody I wasn't, and I don't know what it was that happened for me, but I made a decision, and I went to my husband, and I said, I need help. And we didn't know what that looked like. Like, we were on the phone, like, phoning all these different places, trying to find out, like, what do we do? Here we are, like, maybe she's an addict. Like, we didn't understand that, right? It wasn't part of our world. And his parents, God bless them, they work at the thrift store. They go to Trinity Christian Reformed Church, and Trinity supports Life Recovery. And he phoned his parents, and they said, well, maybe try this option. And so when I went into Life Recovery, I went in October of 2005. I didn't know anything about addiction. I didn't know anything about alcoholism. I didn't know anything about AA, nothing. And I spent 5 months in Life Recovery as a client, and I lied the whole time I was there because I thought I was there to quit crystal meth. I didn't recognize that I had to quit everything. I didn't recognize that abstinence piece. And so I graduated because I'm really good at living 2 different lives, and went straight back into addiction. My kids were not speaking to me at that time. I went home to an empty house. We had moved out here from Langley, so every box was full of my kids. I couldn't do it. So I went back into that friendship with the guy that I was shooting up with, and started shooting up again. 2 months after I graduated from Life Recovery, one night, May 28th, I lied to my husband and told him I was over at a girlfriend's house, and I went out with my buddy, and we got high, and we went down to 264th, where there was an industrial site, and he decided that he was going to steal some copper wire. And we were in a stolen vehicle. He broke into a hydro substation. He went down the steps, and I put the cement piece or the metal piece back over him, and I walked down the road to watch out for the police, and he was electrocuted to death. And that changed my life. The next day, I spent a couple hours with the Langley RCMP, and they interrogated me, and to make sure I didn't actually push them in the hole or anything like that. But I knew from that moment I'd either have to teach myself how to stick a needle in my arm, or I had to make a change. And there was a lady from Langley Victim Services named Marquita, who spent time with me on the steps of the Langley RCMP, and she said, you don't have to live this way anymore. And I knew enough about AA and the program because of Life Recovery that I knew that I could make a change. And God bless Life Recovery. I never had to go back there as a client, but what I started doing was I went there every single day. And I spent every day there, and I helped out, and I sat in the groups, and I learned how to be a sober person again. And I still didn't have my kids in my life, so they were the only thing I had that was real and normal. And they reintroduced me to the God that I knew. And they helped me through the steps of Alcoholics Anonymous stop being angry at God and rebuild that relationship. And I went to them almost every single day for 9 months. I worked at their thrift store 2 days a week. For probably the first couple years of my sobriety, those Wednesday ladies walked me through and taught me how to love myself again. And after about 9 months, Life Recovery finally said, okay, we're going to give you a job. And I started there in a volunteer position, working the midnight to 8 shift, and I made $10 an overnight. And I owed Life Recovery money from when I lived in there because we had to pay 2 rents, so I started paying off my debt to Life Recovery at $10 a night. And I worked that overnight shift for probably a year, and then went into evenings and weekends as a support worker, and started rebuilding my life with the help of women who loved me, who didn't judge me, who understood where I came from, who lost their kids and got them back again. And I started rebuilding relationships back with my kids who were all, you know, more grown up. In fact, my 11-year-old son was the only one that came back home because the girls were older, and he came back home when he was 15. And that was a process too of rebuilding that relationship. And my middle daughter, took her 5 years of sobriety before she spoke to me again because she was so, I mean, I put them through hell, right? And so I worked at Life Recovery, and it became all about helping women because there had to be a reason why I went through what I went through. And I had to be able to use it, otherwise it was for no reason at all. And so that's what I did. And slowly I took my education and put my hours in and took my life skills and did the whole educational piece. And about 4 years ago, they certified me, and 3.5 years ago, they plunked me in this house and said, here you go, see what you can do. And you know, I've been working, so well, second stage is really where my heart is now. I love first stage, but this is really where my heart is, because every day I get to watch women get their first job, or go to their first job interview, or, you know, talk to their kids for that first time, and I went through all of that in my own life, rebuilding a marriage, right? Learning how to have a healthy relationship. I mean, my husband and I are best friends now, and we have an amazing marriage. I have 4, and I'm not supposed to say this, but almost 5 grandkids. I found out at Christmas we're having a 5th grandbaby, and they all live close, and they're my world. And my kids know about AA, and they come to my cakes, and you know, it's become part of my life, right? And so Life Recovery taught me not only how to love myself, but how to love God again, how to forgive myself, and how to teach other women the power of God and the power of recovery and the power of reconciliation in their lives.